Hey everyone, Kelly Dean Allen here. A number of us online guitar players, and many rather famous ones in the music biz as well, have been chiming in over the past week or so with regards to this recent Rolling Stones list of the top 250 guitarists of all time. I've so far shied away from reading this list and criticizing it because it's always the same old shit every time, isn't it? This person's too high on the list. This person's too low. This guitarist should be on the list and this one shouldn't, so on and so forth. Plus, it's a Rolling Stones list, not to be taken as gospel by any means, as it was likely compiled by mostly non-playing music journalists, each with varying levels of knowledge with regards to the guitar and its long and storied history. However, with that said, there is one guitar player that I just naturally assumed would be on the list. And not only on it, but sitting very high on said list. And that guitarist is Irishman Gary Moore. Now, when I discovered that he's not only not sitting up very high on that list, but not on the list at all, it was then that I got my back up, way up, and felt that I needed to say something on the matter. Now, this is not hyperbole when I say that nothing short of a full retraction of this list by Rolling Stone magazine and Gary Moore's subsequent inclusion on a revised list is the only way to correct this massive oversight. Otherwise, this particular list should be shunned, ignored, and not taken seriously in any way whatsoever by anyone, but especially by my fellow guitar players out there. Gary Moore was simply in a league and class of his own when it came to classic rock, hard rock, metal, and blues playing. Not great in one discipline and average or decent in all the others, but an absolute master of each. In my opinion, the most versatile guitar player who's ever lived. And to blindly exclude this virtuosity from their so-called list of the greatest guitarists is simply inexcusable. His latter career blues playing alone should easily drop him into the top 30, and that's saying nothing about his 25 years previous as one of the premier hard rock metal guitarists in the world. Hell, you might as well have just left off Stevie Ray Vaughan and Randy Rhoads off the list as well, if we're just going to ignore those disciplines and those who are playing within them at the highest levels. But see, the thing is, these guys were in the mainstream, Randy Rhoads and Stevie Ray Vaughan, right? And for the most part, Gary was not, but more on that in a bit. Now, this isn't just me as some kind of obsessed Gary Moore fanboy talking here. Among 70s, 80s, and 90s guitar players, he was one of the most respected and admired guitarists of that entire era. I could cite 100 examples of big-name guitarists singing the highest praises of Gary Moore and naming him as a major influence on their own playing. But I'd be here all day were I to do just that. Suffice to say, it's a very long list. Now, to play devil's advocate here just a bit and to try and rationalize this omission somehow, throughout much of his career, Gary didn't have a heck of a lot of exposure in the biggest of all the musical markets in the world, that being North America, of course, with the bulk of his fame being found in Europe and elsewhere. However, that shouldn't bloody matter if you know anything about the guitar, and apparently these knuckleheads at Rolling Stone magazine who compile this list seem to know very little. You know who Gary Moore was, how good he was, and how important and influential a player he was for nearly a 40-year stretch of time, over, like I said, multiple styles and genres of play. Personally, I consider him to be the perfect guitar player because as good as any of the greats who we all know and love really were, the Eddie Van Halens, the Jimi Hendrixes, Stevie Ray Vaughns, the Ritchie Blackmores, Jimmy Page, Eric Clapton, Steve Vai, David Gilmour, so on and so forth, they're almost all to a man players limited to one genre of play. They were masters of their chosen genre, and that was enough to gain them guitar immortality, despite none of them being what one could call truly versatile. And that's not a dig in any way whatsoever. That's just the way it is for the most part. Metal players are metal players, blues players are blues players, rock players are rock players, and jazz players are jazz players, so on and so forth. Gary Moore was a different beast altogether. He was as good as any classic rock guitarist of the 70s. He was equal to, if not better than, most metal shredders during the 80s. And when he turned his attention to the blues throughout the 90s and beyond, he became one of the premier players within that genre until his death in 2011. Simply inexcusable to omit him from this list. Inexcusable and, quite frankly, baffling. Now, some of the omissions, such as John Petrucci, Yngwie Malmsteen, Buckethead, Al Di Meola, Alan Holdsworth, Joe Bonamassa, Albert Lee, Tommy Emmanuel, Marty Friedman, and a whole slew of jazz greats, including, now get this, Joe Pass, seriously, though of course I disagree with their omissions, I can sort of understand their rationale in somewhat of a roundabout way, I suppose. That reason being that many of these artists were just a bit too locked into non-mainstream genres of music. But again, that really shouldn't bloody matter, should it? Many of the greatest players in the world are not part of the mainstream. Hell, I'll go so far as to say that the majority of the best players in the world are not in the mainstream. So with that said, if you're setting out to compile a serious list of the greatest 250 guitarists of all time, the one thing it shouldn't be is a popularity contest. And that's most definitely what this list feels like to me. That said, you absolutely have to look outside the mainstream, or you might as well have just called your list the 250 most popular guitar players in the world. Case in point, and again, it's Rolling Stone magazine, their much vaunted and cited list of the top 500 songs of all time. 499 of them being in English. I mean, really. Now, I certainly understand that English is kind of the universal language of popular music, but we're talking 500 songs here. A way to look outside the mainstream box there, as per usual, Rolling Stone. Anyway, that's all I've got to say about that. My 2 cents on the matter. Thanks for watching, as always. Hope you enjoyed the video. I'd appreciate your thoughts on some of the things that I put forward. If you happen to have an opinion on the matter, you can drop them down below in the comment section. We'll see you next time. Cheers.